All right, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you all here this morning. If you are a guest, if you're not someone who's normally here, we want to say thank you for coming and worshiping with us. If you are someone who's normally here, take a look around for half a second and see if you see a face you don't normally see. And if you didn't say hey to them before services started, make sure that you say hey to them after. Make sure that they know that they are welcome. So I have told this a couple times since I've been up here, but I am someone who loves stories. There was a phase back this time last year where I was going through different fables and looking at those, but stories in general are just something that I love, whether it's movies, TV, books, whatever it is. But one of my favorite kind of stories in general is just weird stories. One of my favorite people to talk to is Ryan Gallagher, because he is one of just the most awkward people in the world, runs into the most awkward people, and has some weird stories about people still mourning the loss of celebrities, in particular race car drivers. Someone who wasn't even related to them just runs into weird people and has weird stories about interactions with them. And I love talking to people who work with other people for a living, because most of the time they have weird stories about something someone said or the way someone interacts with them, and it's just interesting to me the way people work, and weird stories in general are awesome to listen to. And so when it comes to Scripture, there are weird stories everywhere, and they are some of my favorite to look at and think about. One of the ones that comes to mind when you think about weird stories is the story of Elisha and the she-bears. Elisha is walking down the road. Some kids make fun of him for being bald, and he calls she-bears, and they attack the kids. Weird story. Don't know why it's there, but it's there. There are plenty of weird stories that we're more familiar with. When we look at the story of the golden calf, it's a story we're relatively familiar with. Moses goes up on the mountain to talk to God, receive the laws, comes back down, and Israel is worshiping a golden calf. Story seems relatively normal. Israel's unfaithful. But what happens after Moses comes down is weird, because Moses comes down, basically grinds the idol down and puts all the gold dust in water and says, "Here, Israel, drink it." It's a weird punishment. It's a weird story, but it's interesting. And so what I wanted us to do today is look at one of the weird stories in Scripture and see what we can take away from it. Because in a lot of these weird stories, we get some really cool insights as to who we're supposed to be as God's people. And so this is a story we talked not too long ago in our class back in the back with the youth group. But I wanted to spend some more time diving into it. So if you want to turn over to Daniel chapter 4, that's going to be where we start with our lesson today. Daniel chapter 4 is a weird story. It's a longer chapter, so we're going to skip the first little bit of it, but I'm going to summarize it for you. So Daniel chapter 4 starts off with a different voice narrating the story. Daniel chapter 4 starts off with seemingly Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, narrating the story. So Daniel chapter 4, verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show you the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. It's weird. We start off with a different voice. The majority of Daniel is told from Daniel's perspective, but in Daniel chapter 4, we get King Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. It's an interesting change of pace. And then continuing on, verses 3 through 18, we get Nebuchadnezzar telling the start of the story. It's very similar to Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He can't figure out what the dream means, and he starts freaking out. And the dream that he describes for us here is that there is this huge meadow, and there is a huge tree spanning over the meadow. And the tree is great. It's providing shade, and the meadow is plentiful. There's plenty of food growing there, and this tree is just awesome. It gives shade. It gives protection. And it's just an awesome thing to see. And then eventually, something comes in and cuts the tree down, and then over the stump it is put, let's see, what is it again? It's brass, and another kind of metal is put over it. And he's concerned because he sees this dream, sees all the awesome things that the tree is doing for this land that he sees in the dream, and he sees it cut down, and he says, okay, this has to mean something. And it has to mean something big. And so he goes out and he goes to all of the supposed wise men saying, hey, what does this dream mean? And they can't figure it out. They have no idea what's going on. And then we pick up in verse 19, and this is where the story starts to get a little bit interesting. So verse 19 of Daniel chapter 4. Then Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. The king answered and said, Belshazzar, Daniel, let not the dream or interpretation alarm you. Belshazzar answered and said, My Lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. The tree you saw, which grew and became so strong that it reached the top of heaven, and it was visible to the ends of the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful and its fruit abundant, and in which was food for all, under which beasts of the field found shade, and in whose branches the birds of heaven lived. It is you, O king, and you have grown and become strong, and your greatness has grown and reaches to heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. Daniel's interpretation of the dream starts off fantastic. He says, Nebuchadnezzar, you're doing a great job as king. You're blessing the earth. Your kingdom has brought plenty. It has brought stability to the world. Yes, you've taken some other kingdoms in as your slaves, but by and large, your kingdom has been good for the world. People have food. People have plenty. People are doing well. Interpretation starts off great. If I was Nebuchadnezzar, I'd be super happy with the interpretation of the dream so far. But that's not where Daniel ends when he's telling him the dream. Picking back up in verse 23. And because the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven, saying, Chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, in the tender grass of the field, and let him be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portions be with the beasts of the field, till 7 periods of time pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree of the Most High which has come upon my lord the king, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And as it was commanded to leave the stump and the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be confirmed for you from that time that you know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. So start of the interpretation is great. Is, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, you have brought peace and prosperity and good things to the world. Your kingdom's awesome, and it's known to the whole world. You give plenty of food, there's shade for the beasts. You have brought blessings to the land. Interpretation starts off great for Nebuchadnezzar. But as it goes on, it doesn't seem as great. This idea of, hey, I'm this tree and I'm going to get chopped down. And then I'm going to be made to live like the beasts of the field. This idea, let's go back to it in verse, let's see, what verse is it? 23. Towards the end of it, you shall be with the beasts of the field. 7 periods. That you, continuing on to verse 25, you shall be made to eat grass like an ox. You shall be wet with the dew of heaven. Weird things are happening in this dream. This idea that Nebuchadnezzar, this king, is going to be living like a wild beast for 7 periods of time. Most scholars believe this to be 7 years. The word that's translated there can just mean a generic period of time, but most often refers to an actual calendar year. And so this idea of Nebuchadnezzar having to go out and eat grass like an ox for 7 years, getting wet with the dew, meaning he's sleeping outside, and water is condensing on him as he sleeps for 7 years. Weird interpretation. Weird meaning in this dream. And Daniel's advice is, hey, cut off the sins, live the way God wants you to live, and he will hopefully let these things pass from you. And your reign shall be long, prosperous, and it will be good. And this is the interpretation. And Nebuchadnezzar seems to be okay with this. Hey, I've been a blessing to the world. If I do what Daniel says, and I cut off my sins, I cut off my pride, I'm compassionate on the people of the world, this won't happen. I won't be cut down. Nebuchadnezzar seems to be relatively happy with that. But as we continue reading, we kind of see the story continue on. So picking up in Daniel chapter 4, verse 28. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence for the glory of my majesty? While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and dwelling shall be with the beasts of the fields. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will. Terrifying part of the story. This idea of, hey, Nebuchadnezzar gets Daniel's interpretation of this dream. He says, okay, I'll do that. I'll be righteous. I'll try to avoid sin. I'll try to be compassionate to the people. Apparently tries that for a year. Then after a year passes, he's up on top of the palace just looking over everything, enjoying the view, and he says, man, I have made something awesome. Isn't it great? And as he's saying, look at all this that I've done, God looks at him and says from heaven, Nebuchadnezzar, it's not you. You got too much pride. Those things Daniel told you about in your dream are about to become true. You're going to live with the beasts of the field. You're going to eat grass like the ox, and you are going to sleep and wake up with dew on your shoulders. And then continuing on, picking back up in verse 33. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as the eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. Weird. Super weird part of this story is, hey, Nebuchadnezzar is driven crazy and turns into a wild man. This king who's presumably very wealthy, very well educated, a very prosperous person, probably richest person in the world at this time, goes from this person who is relatively tame, ruling over the most powerful nation in the world, relatively sane person, and all of a sudden he's driven mad, goes and lives with the ox, lives with the beasts of the field, eats grass from the field for 7 years, grows his nails out like birds' talons, and lets his hair grow long to the length of eagle feathers. Weird story. Out of nowhere, this king goes from someone who is rich, wealthy, powerful, has a strong mind, and then is driven into madness. But it's not where the story ends. We can continue on through the rest of Daniel chapter 4, picking up in verse 34. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, What have you done? At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and my splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Weird story. Weird story of this king, most powerful king in the world, being turned into a wild man for 7 years. Weird story. But we can take something out of this, and I want us to focus in on how Daniel chapter 4 closes out. Picking back up in verse 37, Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heavens, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. And when we go back to that year after Daniel gives Nebuchadnezzar the interpretation of the dream, the thing that we see lead Nebuchadnezzar into what God is going to punish him with, what is going to cause the problems, and why he is going to be a wild, crazy man for 7 years, is that, guess what? It's all about him, it's all about his pride, and it's all about him putting his trust in the wrong things. You see, Nebuchadnezzar looks at himself and he says, look at this awesome thing that I've built. He says, man, I must be an awesome and powerful king, an awesome and powerful guy to have built something this awesome, this great. He looks at his kingdom and he says, this is a kingdom I can trust. This is a kingdom who is so great that it's never going to fall, seemingly. Nebuchadnezzar puts his trust in himself, puts his trust in his kingdom, and forgets to put his trust in God, who has appointed him to be king of Babylon at this time. And as he's telling the story, as he closes it out, he says, guess what? The thing that was wrong, the thing that made this happen, and the thing that caused all of this trouble in the first place was my pride, my arrogance, and the fact that I was putting my trust into the wrong things. I was putting my trust in the wrong places. And that's what caused me to have these terrible 7 years. My trust was in the wrong place. My trust was in myself. My trust was in my kingdom. My trust was in what I had built and not in God at all. And this is not something that we see isolated to this story in Daniel. Yes, we have this very weird story to get this message across, but this idea of not putting our trust in ourselves, or not putting trust in the things around us, or in Nebuchadnezzar's case, the kingdom that he's built and the governments and countries that are around us, not putting our trust in those things, is a biblical narrative. This idea of, hey, my trust needs to be in the Father first and foremost, not in myself, not in the kingdom, not in the people around me, but in God. And so I want us to look at a handful of those scriptures today and look at those and see what those can tell us about this same story. So the first place that I want us to go is Luke chapter 20. Luke chapter 20, we see Jesus in an interesting story. Luke chapter 20, verse 19. I think this is a story most of us will be familiar with. Luke chapter 20, starting in verse 19. The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him to the authority and the jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked Jesus, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly, and show no partiality, but teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? But he, Jesus, perceived their craftiness and said to them, Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? They said, Caesar's. And he said to them, Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were not able in the presence of these people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. This is another interesting story. Not weird, but interesting story. Because what we tend to focus in on this is the idea of, hey, it is fine to pay your taxes. And that's what they were trying to catch him in, is this trap of the Romans trying to get Jesus to say, you don't have to pay your taxes to the Romans. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. He's saying, first things first, the thing you should be concerned with is giving to God the things that belong to God. This idea of, hey, God has created me, God has made me whole, God has made me who I am, and I need to give my life to God. That should be what matters, not the governmental powers that be. I shouldn't be putting my trust there. I shouldn't be building things up and putting my trust in them. My trust, first and foremost, should be in God who created me. And then this government thing comes second to that. And this idea is present in Romans chapter 13 as well. Romans chapter 13, picking up in verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities and resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. The underlying theme of what Jesus is saying in Luke chapter 20 and what Paul is saying here in Romans 13 is, first things first, trust God more than you are going to trust yourself or these governing authorities that are over you. Trust God, give him everything, and then all these other things are going to fall to the wayside. They're going to become less important. This idea of trusting governing authorities, Nebuchadnezzar trusting the kingdom that he had built, is not the thing that we should be focused on. Is not the thing that we should be putting the emphasis on. Is not the thing that should be the object of our attention. The object of our attention, the thing that we should be putting trust in, the thing that we should be investing in, is our relationship with God. Don't worry about the government. Don't worry about the powers that be. Don't worry about the country that's around you or the government or the terror and horror of what's happening in the government or countries around you. What you need to worry about is being someone who trusts in God, trusts the plan that he has for you, and attending to that plan. And we see Nebuchadnezzar fall into that trap. He says, hey, I've built something awesome. I trust this kingdom, and I'm going to put it above everything else. This thing that I have built, this kingdom that I have built, is awesome, and I trust it. I'm going to put everything into it. But that's not what God says. God looks at him and he says, guess what? You should be putting your trust in me. Jesus and Paul look at the church and the people following Jesus, and they say, guess what? Put your trust in God. Dedicate your life to him. Don't worry about this other thing. Put your trust in God. And this is, like I said, a theme, not necessarily just of government, but in a lot of different things. When we go over to Psalm 118, we get a story of someone who is caught in battle, and their focus is on God. And as they're focused on this battle that they were delivered from, making their way to the temple to worship, the psalmist makes a note. Psalm 118, picking up in verses 8 and 9. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. The idea that is here is that, guess what? My trust shouldn't be in the governmental powers that be. My trust shouldn't be in the people that are around me. They're going to lead me astray. They're going to lead me into pride. They're going to lead me into arrogance. They're going to lead me into sin. My trust should only be in God. That's where my trust should be. I should listen to Him, and I should make that the key focal point of my life. Another place that hits on this idea, and I think hits this idea home and really confirms the ideas that we see in Daniel chapter 4, is a verse we talk about a lot. Proverbs chapter 3, picking up in verses 5 and 6. Proverbs chapter 3, starting in verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. The proverb writer is looking at us and he's saying, guess what? Like Nebuchadnezzar did in Daniel chapter 4, like we see people do all the time, every example of sin that we look at in Scripture, every example of sin that we see in our own lives is this idea of, hey, I've trusted myself more than I trusted God and His will and His desire for my life. And we fall into this trap a lot, whether it's putting trust in ourselves, whether it's putting trust in the government and the powers that be around us, whether it's putting that trust in other people around us who might lead us astray. The reason we have this weird story about Nebuchadnezzar becoming a wild man is he put his trust in the wrong places. He put his trust in himself. He put his trust in what he built. He put his trust in his advisors around him. And guess what? When we make mistakes, when we fall into sin, it's because we've done the same things. We've put too much trust in ourselves. We've put too much trust in those around us. We've put too much trust in the powers that be around us. And we lose sight of who we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to be doing, and what God has called us to be. I want to turn back to Daniel chapter 4 because as we read it, we see a great realization from Nebuchadnezzar as he's recounting the story. Picking back up in verse 34. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored Him who lives forever. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of earth are counted as nothing, and He does according to His will amongst the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth. And none can stay His hand or say to Him, "What have you done?" Jumping down to verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all His works are right and His ways are just. And those who walk in pride He is able to humble. Before we close out on that last phrase, I want us to focus on the phrase before it. For all of His works are right and His ways are just. The things God is calling us to do, the people God has called us to be, is the right way to live. Is a way that is going to lead to success, is a way that's going to lead to an eternity of good things, an eternity in relationship with Him and experiencing the full glory of God. Don't trust in the things around you. Don't trust the people around you. Don't trust yourself, but trust God. Because His ways are right and His ways are just. If you're someone who's been struggling to actually put your trust in God, to remain humble and focus on all the blessings that God has given you. Because all the good things that are here in your life are not because of things that you've done, but because of blessings that God has poured out on you. If you've started trusting in your own ways, started trusting in things that have been built up around you, started trusting in people around you too much, and you've lost sight of who you're supposed to be and who God has called you to be, we're here to love you, we're here to pray for you, and we're here to encourage you as you realize that mistake and as you realize that you want to refocus your life on God and being the person that He has called you to be and trusting in Him. And if you're someone who's been studying about how to become one with God, enter into His kingdom and put your trust in Him fully, the waters are ready and we're ready to welcome you to this family. If you need anything from the church now, please come now as we stand and as we sing.